On the morning of 26 January 1700, the coastal valleys of Vancouver Island were quiet, settled in a winter calm that gave no sign of the massive geological engine locked beneath them. Hours later, an ocean-spanning megathrust fault snapped, sending a devastating tsunami across the Pacific and dropping entire coastal forests into the sea. That single event remains the benchmark for North American seismic risk. Yet today, a far more immediate and detailed threat is coming into focus. Beneath the urban corridors of Southern California, a system directly tied to the same Pacific North American plate boundary that drives our own Cascadia subduction zone off the coast of British Columbia, scientists with the Geological Survey have just mapped a 80-kilometer stretch of fault at a resolution never before achieved in North America. This is not the discovery of a new fault. The San Andreas has been monitored for over a century. The alarm comes from what the high-resolution mapping reveals: a complex, geometrically irregular structure under intense stress, running directly beneath a metropolitan region of 13 million people. Headlines have framed this as a sudden, unprecedented warning of an inevitable apocalyptic catastrophe. But the actual story is sharper, more credible, and ultimately far more important for structural safety across the continent. This high-resolution mapping replaces smooth, theoretical approximations with exact three-dimensional measurements of fault jogs, locked sections, and localized stress concentrations. Knowing the precise geometry of a fault does not mean predicting the exact minute it will fail. It means understanding precisely how energy will propagate when it does. That precision transforms generic panic into actionable engineering data, allowing planners to revise building codes, secure natural gas distribution lines, and update emergency response infrastructure before the ground moves. This episode answers one fundamental question: how does converting vague seismic hazard models into ultra-precise structural maps change our ability to survive the inevitable rupture on North America's most dangerous fault system? To understand why resolution matters, you have to look at how seismic hazard models were previously built. Older maps relied on surface geology, widely spaced regional sensors, and satellite data that smoothed out complex subsurface terrain. They treated major fault lines as flat, uniform planes slicing neatly through the Earth's crust. But real faults are jagged, irregular structures. They step, bend, and vary in dip angle across 3 dimensions. In seismology, these irregularities are known as fault bends and fault jogs. When a rupture traveling through the crust hits a releasing bend, where the fault opens slightly, it often accelerates, concentrating ground motion in specific directions. When it hits a restraining bend, where the fault geometry tightens, the rupture can slow down, stall, or deflect its energy onto adjacent parallel faults. Previous low-resolution maps missed these features at the critical scale of hundreds of meters, where structural failure is actually dictated. The new mapping integrates airborne light detection and ranging, known as LiDAR, dense arrays of hundreds of ground sensors, deep borehole measurements, and satellite radar interferometry capable of detecting ground movement down to the millimeter level. Instead of assuming a smooth line, this unified dataset exposes the actual 3-dimensional shape of the fault zone. It pinpoints exactly where the fault is creeping, releasing energy slowly and safely, and where it is fully locked, accumulating decades of unbroken strain. The focal point of this new data is an 80-kilometer section running from Cajon Pass down through the San Bernardino Valley toward the Salton Sea. Specifically, approximately 24 kilometers southeast of San Bernardino, the new measurements resolved a major structural complexity that older models completely glossed over. A sharp fault jog where the primary fault plane bends roughly 12 degrees over a distance of just 5 kilometers. In 3 dimensions, this is not a simple curve. It is a chaotic zone of multiple parallel fault strands and distributed deformation several kilometers wide. A rupture initiating at Cajon Pass and traveling southeast would hit this jog after roughly 30 to 40 kilometers. Depending on the exact stress state at the moment of failure, this jog will either act as a natural barrier that absorbs energy and slows the rupture down, or it will act as an amplifier, directing a massive pulse of seismic energy straight into the densely populated alluvial basins of the Inland Empire. Communities like San Bernardino, Redlands, and Fontana sit on soft sedimentary deposits that naturally amplify shaking. Incorporating this specific fault geometry into ground motion models means regions previously rated as facing moderate seismic hazard may soon be reclassified into high or extremely high hazard zones. This structural mapping becomes even more critical when combined with stress models analyzing the connection between the San Andreas and the adjacent San Jacinto fault system. At Cajon Pass, these two systems approach each other closely, forming what geophysicists describe as an earthquake gate. Stress analysis indicates that after 169 years of quiet accumulation along this corridor, this gate is effectively unlocked. A rupture starting on one system now has a high probability of jumping to the other, creating a joint rupture event spanning both fault networks. In a maximum credible scenario, a joint failure initiating at Cajon Pass would race through the newly mapped fault jog, maintaining its momentum while simultaneously triggering a parallel rupture on the San Jacinto fault to the west. The combined directivity of this dual rupture would channel concentrated ground motion directly toward the eastern Los Angeles basin and the San Gabriel Valley. The ultimate value of this mapping lies in the window of opportunity it opens before the next major event occurs. Natural Resources Canada, Emergency Management BC, and emergency agencies across North America track these structural updates because transboundary infrastructure, trade corridors, and national building code frameworks rely on the same fundamental geophysical science. When seismic hazard models are updated with real fault geometry, critical infrastructure such as natural gas networks, electrical transmission grids, water supply lines, and rail routes through mountain passes can be systematically retrofitted. The contrast between the magnitude 7.4 earthquake in Japan in April 2026, which resulted in 0 structural fatalities, and similar magnitude events in unprepared regions, demonstrates that disaster is not dictated by geology alone, but by the gap between scientific knowledge and structural engineering. The fault geometry is mapped, the stress is documented, and the countdown on a major North American rupture continues. The real test is how quickly our built environment adapts to the true shape of the threat beneath it. On January 9, 1857, at precisely 8:20 a.m. local time, the ground along a 350-kilometer stretch of the southern San Andreas Fault suddenly displaced by up to 9 meters, triggering the Fort Tejon earthquake, a magnitude 7.9 event that remains one of the largest recorded in North American history. For over 169 years since that morning, that specific section of the continental plate boundary has not experienced a full segment megathrust failure. That length of quiet accumulation is not a sign of safety, it is a raw count of missing energy. To understand how that historical baseline defines the present danger across North America's Pacific margin, you have to look at how seismologists historically mapped and measured these massive fault systems. For decades, the baseline assumptions governing building codes from California up to British Columbia were based on low-resolution surface surveys and widely spaced regional seismographs. In Canada, researchers at the Geological Survey of Canada and Natural Resources Canada used similar regional networks to establish the baseline for our own major fault systems, such as the Queen Charlotte Fault off Haida Gwaii, which generated a magnitude 8.1 earthquake in 1949, the largest ever instrumentally recorded in Canada, and the Cascadia subduction zone off Vancouver Island, which has been locked since its last catastrophic rupture on January 26, 1700. The fundamental design assumption across all these continental systems was that major strike-slip faults could be modeled as relatively simple linear planes. Engineers assume that strain accumulated uniformly at a steady rate, roughly 20 to 30 millimeters per year, and that when failure occurred, the energy release could be calculated using smoothed, two-dimensional averages over vast distances. Sensational headlines often frame earthquake risk as an overdue timer ticking down to a sudden, random explosion. But the historical reality revealed by modern geophysics is far more precise. Earthquake hazard is an ongoing mechanical accounting system based on displacement deficits and structural geometry. The accurate story is not that a fault is simply old and due for a shake, but that the internal architecture of the fault dictates exactly where that stored energy is concentrated and how it will be delivered into the surrounding rock when the boundary slips. Historical seismology was limited by the resolution of its instruments. In the mid-20th century, scientists mapped fault zones by observing surface ruptures, topographic offsets on hillsides, and distant seismic waves recorded by sensors tens or hundreds of kilometers apart. They could outline the general path of a fault line, but they could not see the three-dimensional structures operating 10 to 20 kilometers beneath the surface. These deeper structures, such as localized stress traps, lock disparities, and subsurface fault bends, are the precise engines that control rupture dynamics. Because older models could not resolve these subsurface features, engineers designed municipal infrastructure, natural gas pipelines, transportation corridors, and high-rise structures based on generalized ground motion estimates. They calculated potential shaking by assuming energy would radiate uniformly outward from a straight line, rather than considering how complex underground geometry focuses seismic energy into lethal, high-intensity beams aimed directly at specific urban centers. The physics of this displacement deficit are straightforward. Tectonic plates move continuously, driven by mantle convection. Where two plates meet along a strike-slip boundary, friction prevents them from sliding smoothly past one another. The boundary locks, but the deeper continental plates continue to move. The rock along the locked zone deforms elastically, storing immense mechanical potential energy like a compressing steel spring. The amount of stored energy is directly proportional to the annual slip rate multiplied by the time elapsed since the last major rupture. At an average loading rate of 25 millimeters per year, 169 years of lock along the southern San Andreas represents a displacement deficit of over 4.2 meters of unreleased tectonic movement along a segment directly connected to the broader Pacific Plate boundary. When the mechanical shear stress on the lock section finally exceeds the frictional strength of the rock interface, the spring snaps. The stored elastic strain converts instantaneously into kinetic energy, radiating as seismic waves that travel through the crust at speeds exceeding 3 kilometers per second. Understanding this historic baseline reveals why the newly released ultra-high-resolution mapping fundamentally alters the risk profile. By combining airborne LiDAR, satellite radar interferometry, and dense arrays of subsurface sensors, geophysicists have exposed the actual 3D mechanics that previous generations of scientists could only estimate. The historical baseline assumed a simple, broad zone of risk. The new mapping proves that stress is hyper-concentrated at specific geometric anomalies that will dictate the destructive path of the next major rupture. To evaluate how this evolving science impacts structural safety, observers should monitor three specific technical developments. First, whether the Canadian Hazards Information Service and international bodies issue updated seismic hazard maps incorporating 3D fault geometry into regional building codes. Second, whether continuous satellite radar shows accelerating micro-deformation around the newly identified fault jog near San Bernardino. And third, whether deep borehole strainmeters detect localized microseismicity migrating toward the Cajon Pass intersection. Until those technical milestones occur, the historical baseline stands as a clear warning. 169 years of accumulated strain is holding in place, waiting for the precise geometric failure that will define the next major North American event. Three separate monitoring stations situated hundreds of kilometers apart across the continental plate margin, from deep borehole strainmeters near San Bernardino to seismic sensors along the Cascadia subduction zone off Vancouver Island, all recorded the exact same subsurface signature, a subtle sub-millimeter shift in crustal deformation that signals a fundamental change in fault stress. Headlines often mischaracterize these shifts as a sudden, unpredictable cracking of the Earth's surface, but the actual physics are far more compelling. This is a precise mechanical failure cascade occurring across a complex 3D network of locked, friction-bound rock. The catalyst is not a foreign force. It is the culmination of four distinct observational technologies, finally revealing the exact failure mechanics operating 10 to 20 kilometers beneath our feet. To grasp why this breaking point is so critical, you need to understand the four-part integration that makes this mapping unique. First, airborne LiDAR scans the surface terrain at sub-metre resolution, removing vegetation to expose ancient fault scarps and physical offsets. Second, dense seismic arrays deploying hundreds of closely spaced geophones capture micro-earthquakes down to magnitude 0.5. Mapping thousands of these tiny events locates the active fault plane in 3 dimensions with surgical precision. Third, satellite interferometric synthetic aperture radar, or INSAR, tracks ground deformation over months and years, measuring surface displacement down to single millimeters. Fourth, deep borehole strainmeters directly measure stress changes at depth, providing physical data that surface sensors cannot capture. When these 4 streams integrate, they uncover the precise physical mechanism of a strike-slip fault under stress. In a simple fault model, 2 tectonic blocks slide past each other along a single, smooth friction surface. Friction holds the rock stationary while the underlying tectonic forces push continuously, deforming the surrounding crust like a giant spring. In a complex, real-world fault zone, however, the interface is filled with structural irregularities known as asperities, fault jogs, and stepovers. As strain accumulates, the stress does not distribute evenly. Instead, it concentrates at specific geometric pinch points. The newly mapped 80-kilometer section reveals an extreme concentration of shear stress centered directly on a 12-degree fault jog located 24 kilometers southeast of San Bernardino. This jog creates a structural bottleneck. On the incoming side of the bend, the sliding movement is blocked, forcing the crust to compress and store elastic energy at rates significantly higher than the regional average. This brings us to the breaking point, the mechanism of dynamic rupture propagation. When the frictional resistance at a locked asperity finally gives way, the sudden movement releases stored elastic strain as a rapidly expanding crack in the rock. This crack, the rupture front, moves along the fault plane at velocities between 2 and 3 kilometers per second, nearly the speed of sound in solid granite. As the rupture front travels, it radiates seismic waves outward. If the rupture encounters a smooth, uninterrupted fault plane, it can maintain its speed and energy over vast distances. But when the rupture front hits a major geometric feature like the newly mapped 12-degree fault jog, one of 2 physical mechanisms occurs. In the first case, the geometric complexity absorbs energy, forcing the rupture front to decelerate or split into multiple smaller strands, which limits the total seismic magnitude. In the second, far more dangerous case, the immense stress concentrated on the jog allows the rupture front to jump across the fault stepover without losing speed. If it jumps the gap, the rupture can link directly into adjacent fault systems, such as the San Jacinto fault near Cajon Pass, converting a localized earthquake into a multi-fault mega-rupture that spans hundreds of kilometers. This multi-fault triggering mechanism is what geophysicists at the University of Bern identified as unlocking the earthquake gate. The new mapping proves that the physical geometry to support such a cascade is fully present in the subsurface crust. Older hazard models, built on simplified 2D assumptions, failed to account for this step-over geometry and significantly underestimated the potential ground motion that such a multi-fault rupture would generate. To track how this breaking point unfolds, researchers and monitoring agencies are keeping a close watch on 3 specific indicators. First, whether microseismicity arrays detect an increase in low-magnitude earthquake swarms clustered directly around the 12-degree fault jog. Second, whether INSAR radar data shows localized strain rates accelerating along the Cajon Pass intersection. And third, whether Natural Resources Canada and the Geological Survey of Canada update regional hazard assessments to reflect potential multi-fault cascade scenarios across North America's shared Pacific margin. Until those observational networks confirm a shift, The physical data shows a system loaded to its mechanical limit, waiting for the rupture front that will test these structural boundaries. At 4:31 a.m. on January 17, 1994, a previously unmapped blind thrust fault ruptured beneath Northridge, California, causing 57 deaths, over 8,700 injuries, and more than $50 billion in direct damage. Yet the most critical takeaway for civil engineers was not the immediate collapse of concrete bridges along major highways. It was how localized ground motion exceeded building code design thresholds by up to 50%. When subsurface fault dynamics are undercalculated, the resulting ground motion tears apart infrastructure built to handle only average shaking. The newly released 3D mapping of the 80-kilometer southern San Andreas corridor proves that this exact undercalculation exists across major North American transportation and supply lifelines today. While sensational headlines focus on cinematic images of ground gaping open, the true impact is a cascading engineering failure across interrelated infrastructure networks. Translating subsurface fault mechanics into real-world terms reveals that a major rupture along this 80-kilometer mapped segment does not just affect the immediate epicentral zone. It directly threatens critical transboundary supply chains that connect Canadian markets to major Pacific ports and southern trade corridors. When high-intensity seismic waves hit critical infrastructure, the primary point of failure is often subtle. Natural gas distribution pipelines shear under lateral ground displacement. High-voltage electrical corridors trip out from extreme tower swaying, and municipal water mains rupture at joints unable to withstand differential soil movement. Consider the physical scale of these lifelines. Through the Cajon Pass, the narrow mountain corridor where the San Andreas and San Jacinto fault lines converge, runs a dense concentration of critical infrastructure. This includes primary interstate rail lines carrying freight across North America, major transcontinental natural gas pipelines, high-voltage electricity transmission lines feeding metropolitan grids, and major interstate highways handling tens of thousands of commercial trucks daily. If a rupture occurs along the newly mapped fault jog 24 kilometers southeast of San Bernardino, the ground displacement across these narrow corridors could reach 2 to 4 meters in a matter of seconds. To put that figure in perspective, a 3-meter lateral shift across a railbed or highway deck is the equivalent of snapping a multi-track steel railway bridge like a wooden matchstick. For Canadians, a disruption of this magnitude along major continental rail and freight arteries instantly halts the flow of fresh agricultural produce, manufacturing components, and consumer goods moving north. It mirrors the economic shock experienced during the November 2021 atmospheric river floods in British Columbia, which severed every highway and rail connection between Vancouver and the rest of Canada, cutting off the Port of Vancouver and stranding billions of dollars in freight for weeks. Beyond transportation arteries, the natural gas distribution network presents the highest consequence secondary threat in any major strike-slip rupture. When high-intensity seismic shaking ruptures high-pressure gas distribution pipes underneath urban roads, escaping gas ignites from severed electrical lines or static sparks. At the exact same time, widespread ruptures in municipal water mains cause water pressure across firefighting networks to drop to zero. This lethal combination, simultaneous fires breaking out across multiple neighborhoods while firefighters have no water pressure, is precisely the mechanism that turned the 1857 Fort Tejon and 1906 San Francisco earthquakes into historic urban catastrophes. In densely populated Inland Empire communities like San Bernardino, Redlands, Loma Linda, Colton, Fontana, and Rancho Cucamonga, hundreds of thousands of residents live on soft alluvial soils that naturally amplify ground shaking. Thousands of multifamily housing units, commercial buildings, and public facilities constructed prior to 1990 building code updates remain un-retrofitted. The new high-resolution mapping proves that ground motion in these specific alluvial zones will be far more intense than current municipal building codes account for. The real-world escalation is not just a future possibility, it is a current engineering deficit. Siting decisions for hospitals, schools, and energy substations made using older 2D fault maps assumed facilities were at a safe setback distance from the primary fault trace. The new 3D data reveals that the subsurface zone of potential ground rupture and severe shear strain is significantly wider than previously mapped. To monitor how this real-world risk is managed, civil authorities and structural engineers are tracking three key developments. First, whether natural gas utilities accelerate the installation of automated seismic shutoff valves across high-risk fault crossings. Second, whether municipal transportation departments initiate priority retrofits on critical overpasses identified within the newly expanded high-hazard corridor. And third, whether Public Safety Canada and provincial emergency management bodies like Emergency Management BC update cross-border supply chain contingency plans for a long-term disruption to southern rail and freight corridors. Until those infrastructure upgrades are completed, the newly mapped fault section represents an active, unmitigated vulnerability sitting directly beneath North America's most vital economic arteries. A single number flashing on a digital display in the Canadian Hazards Information Service Monitoring Centre in Ottawa, a regional strain rate recorded at sub-millimetre precision, tells the entire story of North America's shared plate boundary. That single reading is not a prediction of tomorrow's news. It is a direct measurement of 169 years of locked elastic strain along the continent's most heavily populated fault zone. Many online commentators claim this new high-resolution dataset proves an earthquake is imminent within days or weeks. But the honest scientific boundary is far more nuanced and infinitely more useful. What geophysicists have established with absolute certainty is the exact 3D geometry of the hazard, while what remains genuinely unresolved is the exact moment frictional resistance will fail. We now know precisely where shear stress is concentrated, specifically at the newly mapped 12-degree fault jog 24 kilometers southeast of San Bernardino. And we know that the earthquake gate connecting the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems at Cajon Pass is mechanically unlocked. What science cannot predict is whether the impending rupture will stall at that fault jog or jump the gap to trigger a catastrophic multi-fault cascade. Ground motion modeling using this new three-dimensional input is being finalized right now, and its findings will force a complete rewrite of building codes, emergency scenarios, and critical infrastructure planning across the continent. The difference between survival and disaster on an active plate boundary comes down to what happens in the window between mapping a hazard and the moment the ground moves. When the magnitude 7.4 earthquake struck off Japan in April 2026, 0 deaths were recorded despite violent shaking, because decades of precise engineering investments, rigid code enforcement, and public readiness had prepared every building for that exact ground motion. Conversely, when a magnitude 7.5 earthquake struck Venezuela in June 2026, the absence of structural hardening and modern building codes resulted in tens of thousands of casualties. Southern California, and North America as a whole, possesses the institutional capacity, engineering expertise, regulatory frameworks, and financial capital to achieve the Japanese outcome. The Shake Alert Early Warning Network is active, municipal soft story retrofit mandates are underway, and agencies like Public Safety Canada and Emergency Management BC are integrating real-time seismic data into national alerting systems. What remains undone is translating the full, ultra-high-resolution specificity of this new 3D fault map into the concrete realities of our built environment. Hardening gas distribution lines across mapped shear zones, retrofitting vulnerable housing stock, and securing continental freight corridors before the rupture front initiates. To track how this situation develops, there are 3 specific, checkable milestones to watch on the official record. First, watch for the publication of revised ground motion models by international hazard mapping consortiums, which will formally reclassify hazard levels for communities across the Inland Empire. Second, monitor seismic bulletins from Natural Resources Canada and the Geological Survey for advisories regarding multi-fault interaction research along shared Pacific Plate boundaries. And third, watch for legislative moves by state and provincial building officials to mandate structural retrofits based on 3D fault geometry rather than legacy 2D approximations. Until those specific policy and engineering updates occur, the situation remains unchanged. The fault is fully locked, the displacement deficit continues to grow at over 25 millimeters per year, and the physical geometry of the next major rupture is now clearly visible to science. The mapping did not create the danger beneath our feet. It simply ended our ability to claim we did not see it coming. Tell me in the comments where in Canada or across North America you are watching from, and whether your local community is actively updating its infrastructure for severe seismic hazards. Subscribe to follow each critical update as new hazard assessments and ground motion models are published.